Hello, everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are continuing our interview series. This one is actually not in connection to Kink Fest. We recently watched a presentation on YouTube that was given by Julie Fennell. If you're on Patreon, you may have remembered that video. And I actually got in contact with Julie to discuss some of her findings and that whole process of researching the BDSM community. And we will talk a little bit more about exactly what that research was. But just to get started, Julie, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. My name is Julie Fennell. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. I also have a blog, slutphd.com, and you can also find me in a lot of places on the internet as IP Cookie Monster, although I'm trying to consolidate my life a little bit under the SlutPhD label. I've been involved in the BDSM community for 10 years. I actually just celebrated my 10th Kinkiversary like 2 weeks ago. And I've been researching the scene since 2012 as the primary focus for my research. And in general, my research looks at sexuality, gender, the intersection between those things, and also kind of deviance. So I'm also looking at things like polyamory, paganism, and coming at things from that angle.
That's great. I know one of the first things I thought when I came across your work was like, wait, there's somebody who's a sociologist, who's kinky, and is actually really studying this, because I have read so many books about kink. I've tried to do the research, and from my own experience, and you definitely are more up to date on the academic literature than I am, a lot of the studies that talk about things, for example, like the phenomena of subspace, tends to be more extrapolated from not kink specific ritual things like hook pulls, other rites, pagan rites, etc., as opposed to more directly studying the kink community.
Well, there have been a couple of studies of the kink community done by sociologists. So the two published books to date that are of the kink community, as opposed to, say, the leather community from like a lot longer ago. There's a book by Stacey Newmar called Playing on the Edge, and there's a book by Margot Wise, who's technically an anthropologist, who's called Techniques of Pleasure. In the case of Margot Wise, she very intentionally didn't do BDSM. Like, I'm not a kinkster, but she like participated in the organizational side of the community. I find her study, frankly, alienating. I hope she's not listening to this, but I find it a little alienating, frankly, that someone came in and was just so actively uninvolved in the BDSM side of the BDSM community. To me, it's like straight people coming in and studying gay community. Like, you can do it, but recognize how limited you are. And I would say that she didn't. And as for Stacey Newmar, she actually participated, but she did not identify as kinky, very adamantly so. She only participated as a bottom. Partly because her ethics board she said she didn't want to try to get it by her ethics board to see what it would be like to top. But she wasn't doing it because it was something she wanted to do. She was just sort of doing it as this like experiment, basically, which again to me was like, oh, I'm straight. I'm going to try go having lesbian sex and see what that's like. What do lesbians get out of this experience? Like, I don't think you're going to find out. If it's not something that you're not deeply motivated towards. But at least admire the fact that she did participate in the community fully. But again, like, her motivations for doing it were just clearly not why the rest of us were here. And she didn't really seem to fully get that. Like, she seemed to think that she could understand why we were here from what she was doing. There's at least one sociologist, two really, that I know who are involved in the community. Neither of them is out. Neither of them have published books. I've just finished a book manuscript. It's called Please Scream Quietly. It's currently under review with University of Michigan Press. We'll see what its future is. If you want to follow, yeah, fingers crossed. Follow me online and you will find out what the future of my book. So if it gets published, I will be the first sociologist who's an insider who's studying the pansexual scene in the United States. Oh, there's one other person who is Robin Bauer, who's German, who studied the German dyke plus trans BDSM communities in Germany and America. And Bauer does identify as kinky, and their title of their book is, I think, something critiques of consent. I'm losing the exact name of it, but they were more of an insider than the other people for sure. But they also weren't really studying the pansexual scene, so depends on what you're looking for.
Very true. I know from the things that I did find, like, for example, if you're looking at kind of like queer theorists, right? You're looking at people like Gail Rubin, you're getting some insight into BDSM there, but it's a very specific segment of the BDSM community, not necessarily speaking to that pansexual American perspective, which is, I don't know the numbers for everything, but is most likely a much larger community than the lesbian German community is, I would imagine.
I think that it pretty much has to be by the numbers, yes.
So I'm also curious in general about this research and the whole process behind it, especially because so many of the other people who have studied it before haven't been part of the communities themselves. Was it difficult to get started? Did you have to go through a period of like trying to get this proposed and have your university accept that you wanted to do this research? What was that like?
It was special. So I'd been in the community relatively loosely for about 2 years, and I was really frustrated at that point because I felt like the research seemed to not represent my experience or that of the people around me. So I was like, I'm here. I'll do it. So I submitted my proposal to the ethics review board at my university, and they were hostile, to say the least. So sure most people listening probably aren't familiar with that's usually like. Usually as an academic, a sociologist proposing research to an ethics board, you fill out some paperwork and occasionally they give you a little bit of a hard time, but mostly it's kind of a rubber stamp deal by and large. In this case, however, they summoned me to be subjected to an inquisition by the entirety of the ethics board. It's like 20 people. And I talked to one of my friends on the board. She was like, yeah, I genuinely have, this has never happened before. The person in charge of it proceeded to tell me that she thought that what I was doing was unethical. She compared it to the Tuskegee study, which is this infamous study of like, these Black men with syphilis in Alabama. And then she corrected herself. She's like, no, it's more like the photographers who took pictures of people being lynched and didn't stop it.
Oh my God.
And I was like, well, why? And I was like, well, why do you think that is? And she said, well, I think it's immoral if you stand by and watch people hurt and don't try to stop them. And I said, even if they're in the middle of having an orgasm? She was dead silent. So I got my approval. Honestly, I really believe that being an insider had a big effect on that. Like, I was, as they were subjecting me to this inquisition, I told them a few times, I'm like, you're insulting me, basically. Like, you're trying to tell me that what I do, that my lifestyle is wrong. Are you really prepared to go out on that limb to say that? And I think they felt pretty shamed by that. And so, they gave me my approval. The university actually ended up giving me some money. They didn't give me a lot, but they gave me, they gave me a fair sum of money to study the thing. My department chair was insanely supportive. She was amazing. She came with me to this inquisition from the ethics board, and she was always on my side. She's like, academic freedom, like, you should be allowed to do whatever research that is, reasonably ethical for you to do, and this is certainly within those bounds. So I always had the support of my chair, which was really great, because at that point I didn't have tenure. It was close, but I was close. So I intentionally started doing the project knowing that I wouldn't be publishing anything from it until I had tenure. And in case, again, you're listening, you don't know what tenure is. Tenure is basically if you're a professor at a university, once you have it, it's very hard to fire you. But before that, it's very easy to fire you. Yeah, I knew that I wouldn't probably be publishing anything from it until after I had tenure. And that was very strategic on my part because my research before that was relatively respectable. I was researching contraceptive decision making. Yeah, so I made that transition, and it was really interesting moving from being just a participant in the community to being a researcher in the community. Partly because people were really excited about that. Like, I had a little bit of a reputation within the community before I started. Like, people knew that I was really involved. I had lots of pictures online. And people knew that I was, like, for real. Like, I wasn't just coming in for 2 seconds to do this. And so when I would go places, people were so excited most of the time to talk to me, and they were just thrilled that somebody who was an insider was doing this research. I never had trouble finding people to interview. There was only one event that I ever ran into any trouble with, and that was because the person who was like on the board of that event was like dating this guy who I was sort of involved with.
Oh,
and
so it was just like polydrama, essentially.
But yeah, it was kind of, I wasn't even really dating him. It wasn't even really authentic polydrama, but it was like this stupid jealousy thing. And then, but I only found out about that from him. Like, no one from that group ever told me that there was an issue. And so, you know, everywhere I went, people knew what I was doing, and they were really supportive. So that was back in 2012. I was going around to lots of different events. I interviewed people all through the Mid-Atlantic BDSM scene. So I collected 70 interviews back then and did lots and lots of participant observation. So I intentionally went to events that I would not normally go to. So I'd try to get a sense of the breadth of the scene. And then after that, I retired from doing field work at that point and interviewing, and I just became a Kinkster for a really long time. And then in 2017, in April of 2017, I decided to launch an internet survey because I wanted to get a broader perspective about what things were, because there's just not much actual hard numbers on a lot of things. And so at that point, still everyone basically who was involved in the public BDSM scene was on FetLife. That changed quickly right afterwards. But in April of 2017, it was still true that most people who were heavily involved in the scene were still pretty active on FetLife. So it was pretty easy to recruit people through FetLife back then. Now it would be a much bigger challenge. But I got about 1,600 respondents to an English language survey for that. And so I have some of the only numbers pertaining to certain aspects of the scene of pretty much anybody, which is a fun feeling. I have data that lots of people want that almost nobody has. It's great. So I use all of that in writing my book. I also published a paper last year on Bdsm Spirituality. So looking at the way that the Kinksters do spirituality, both in terms of like sort of more atheistic approaches and in more intentionally religious spiritual approaches. And I've got another paper that's under review on sexuality and BDSM, although pretty much all of that information is in my book.
Yeah, the whole process is just so fascinating to me because I have definitely had probably a good handful over the last year, 2 years or so of people, I think probably somewhere either trying to get their master's degree or trying to get their PhD in sociology, anthropology, name your social science, who want to study the BDSM community but are typically outsiders themselves and are like, hi, random person from the internet who makes YouTube videos. Will you tell me about BDSM so I can write my paper? And that's, I don't mean to like laugh at the people who are doing that, because obviously you need to start your research somewhere. But I do find it funny, kind of the approach of someone who is maybe outside of the BDSM community attempting to start to understand it for a paper versus somebody inside of the community trying to fight to have the ability to do the research they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, in any subculture or culture as a whole, I think there's great value with both insiders and outsiders studying it. So one of the classic examples that I always point to is there's this amazing paper, a guy, his last name is Kaplow, Theodore Kaplow, I think. And in it, he goes through, he's an American himself, I presume, and he goes through and he outlines all the rules that Americans have for Christmas gift giving. I mean, this is a great paper. You can see it on the internet. It's really fun to read. And part of why it's so funny is because you read it and you're like, oh, as an American, I could never possibly outline all these rules. I try it with my students. I'm like, give me the rules for gift giving. And they come up with none of them, right, that are in this paper. And this person goes through and you're like, oh, but all of these rules are true, but we never name them. And that's the goal of any good sociologist, is to go through and try to find the rules for something that most other people don't notice. And a lot of times that's actually easier to do as an outsider than as an insider. It takes a lot of work to be able to come to something that's familiar to you with the eyes of a stranger, which is one of the real goals of good sociology. But at the same time, when you're talking about something which I believe does have probably biological, like deep intrinsic motivations to it, there is something there that is hard to get if you don't understand what motivates people. I think it's really easy as an outsider to come to BDSM and say, I think these people are all just doing this for reason X, right? Whatever you decide that reason is. So it's, conspicuous consumption, or it's just an excuse to be social. And all of those things are true. It is definitely a place where there's a lot of conspicuous consumption of a particular variety. And it is definitely true that people are highly motivated by their desire to be social. It doesn't change the fact that for people like me, pain is something that I just have always processed as pleasurable since I was 5 years old. And being surrounded by other people who understand what it means to have that be a part of your life, and also all of the shame that comes with that, especially the shame associated with wanting to hurt other people. I think it's hard as an outsider to come through and understand that, people aren't just making something up when they tell you about that. They're not just motivated by their desire for these other things. There is an actual biological thing happening there. I think it's biological. I also believe that those sociologists have been socialized to a particular view of sex and sexuality. And so they bring that with them, and that's hard to let go. I think our general social construction of sex and sexuality is probably mostly bullshit, based mostly on gender and biological sex, as if those are the things that everybody finds most important. And I think that the evidence is at best to support that conclusion, that that's something that even most people, it's the thing that's most important to them in sexual attraction and partnership. And certainly at the point where you come to the BDSM community, I think you'll find lots of people for whom that is third, fourth, fifth, 10th on the list of things that are most important to them in sexual attraction. And so I think a lot of times what those outsiders are bringing with them is a preconceived social bias about what it means to experience pleasure. And it's not even just sex, but pleasure. And it's really hard to let go of those ideas because they were socialized to them and they don't have any particular motivation necessarily to let go of them. But if you're highly motivated, then you have to start really thinking about, well, what is it that people think is important in terms of their attraction? And if you're like me and the answer is, wow, that's complicated, then you have a lot of reasons to overthink that.
Immediately when you mentioned that, I thought of somebody who contacted me relatively recently from outside of the BDSM community in relation to conspicuous consumption in BDSM, essentially to say, do people in the BDSM community realize that what they're doing is conspicuous consumption? As though that is the sole thing that's going on there. That's the core motivation, and that, somebody from outside who's never probably been in a dungeon, somebody who's probably never experienced it for themselves would be able to just go, yes, I understand what these people are doing, and allow me to explain it to them. I think is the issue is you don't want to have your own experience explained to you necessarily by somebody who's coming at it with their own bias without kind of being able to know what's in the head of somebody who's doing it right. And then something else I'm wondering, because you did bring up the biological component of this, do you know of anyone who's studying this from a neurobiological perspective, actually, putting monitors on kinky people and seeing what their brains do when they're engaging in BDSM?
I know one guy in the kink community who does that, although it is unclear to me to the best of my knowledge, he's never published any academic papers on it. So I've just seen him chatting at various BDSM events about having put brain monitors on people while they were being tied up or in subspace or whatever. So he and I have talked a little bit, but to the best of my knowledge, he hasn't published any academic papers on that. I feel like I would know if he had. There's definitely the lab that you mentioned, the group of people who were studying the hook pull rituals. I think they have a Twitter. It's BDSM science or something like that. Science of BDSM, maybe. And they kind of do some of that type of thing. But I mean, you're always getting people late in life, right? No ethics board is ever going to approve us going around and poking 5-year-olds and seeing how they respond, right? And to me, that's the part that's actually the most interesting, is talking to a lot of the people who say, oh, well, I was like this since I was a kid, which is true for me in terms of my in terms of a lot of my kink, I guess. Certainly in terms of my sadomasochism, I feel like I'm like, no, I can't remember a time when, say, putting peroxide on a cut wasn't something that I kind of got a special thrill from. Like, that's the kind of pain that I'm into. And I'm a real connoisseur of pain, personally. You know, again, this isn't something that most people are, right? Most people can't give you a long list of pains that they're into and not into. And to be fair, most people in the BDSM community can't either, which I think is also really interesting. So a common misconception is that most people in the kink community are sadomasochists. Actually, they're relatively scarce compared to the people who are into power stuff, like way more than the physical stuff. And I think there's a much better case to be made about just sort of pure social motivations for people who are into the stuff that's all about power, and it's not really about a physical experience of pain when you talk about that, which is also another reason why I find a lot of these conversations get very frustrating, is because people have so many motivations for engaging in this thing that we call BDSM, but deciding even what constitutes BDSM is an academic argument that could go on for weeks, months, years. My usual response to that as a sociologist is, well, it's BDSM if Kinksters say it is. That's all I can come up with, because I've never seen any logic to what kinky people decide is kink. But, you know, if people in the kink community say it's BDSM, well, then it must be. But I definitely see a pretty interesting line between the motivation to engage in, you know, 24/7 heavy level dominant submission type relationships versus the kinds of people who just really want to be hurt or hurt somebody else for sexual pleasure. Those are actually fairly different things. We happen to all get along pretty well by and large, but they are fairly different things.
Yeah, and my understanding is, you know, before we had BDSM, even as an acronym, there was a fair amount of separation between the B and D people and the S&M people, and then eventually it coalesced into one larger label. So, yeah.
Well, I think the label, my impression was that from talking to people historically, and you can even see it in the academic literature. So until 2013, 2014, most of the academic literature referred to SM, which was years after people in the BDSM community were using BDSM as an acronym. And it's only within the last, I think, 2 years that you can find academic work that even was willing to use the word kinky, which Kinksters have been saying for much longer than that too. Again, some of that's academic lag time, right? There's a long, I mean, my research is from 2012, and in the best case scenario, my book probably won't be published until late 2020. So there's often a long lag there. But in addition to that, it just felt like a lot of the researchers were really resisting that label. But the old school label, and I could even find this among people that I interviewed, like much older people, would talk about sadomasochists, S&M, and then the academic version of that was SM. And then by the early 2000s, the BDSM acronym had become far more common within the community. But I don't think it was ever so much that the people themselves were separate. It's just the acronym didn't really represent what was going on. And even to this day, there definitely is there are a lot of subcultures within the BDSM subculture. So there's a clear like rope subculture, and there's a clear femdom subculture, and there's also clear age play groups. Like there definitely some segmented groups that have their own particular interest, and they all come to the same conventions most of the time, but sometimes they don't. So if you hang out with people in like the master slave community, they tend to have very little to do with the people in the mainstream pansexual BDSM community, and everybody seems to prefer it that way. They don't share much in the way of a lot of values and common desires, and so they tend to hang out further apart.
Oh, really? That's interesting. I mean, you're from the DC area. I'm from probably as far away in the country as you could get from that. I have gone to events in like Chicago and kind of closer out that way, but out here, there's been a lot of effort to integrate leather SM with general leather and then the pansexual BDSM community. So a great example of that would be some of our local events like Kink Fest, which do have contingents kind of representing all of that and having shared space together. And I'm not sure what that is on the East Coast, but then that just goes to speak to how different the BDSM community can be in different places, and how in some areas it's more integrated between those subcultures and other areas are very much not. And they are, here's the rope dojo, and all of the rope people go to the rope dojo, and they never ever would dream of going to a general BDSM event,
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends. It definitely depends a lot on where you are, and usually it's historically related to a single institution. So, I mean, I refer to it as a culture of microcultures, and so the BDSM community is highly dependent on typically a single local dungeon. Sometimes a single charismatic individual exerts a truly spectacular degree of influence. But like, for example, if you go down to Atlanta, Georgia, the gay lesbian community there is a lot more integrated into the pansexual scene than it is in a lot of the other countries, because that's the way their dungeon operates. It depends on where you are, for sure. And then there are other parts of the country, as you say, where like the gay leather community is much more integrated with the pansexual scene. But I haven't been anywhere yet. But I add the careful caveat there of yet, where I saw like a strong integration of master-slave community, which is a particular, and that's mostly straight people, at least in terms of its overall construction, master-slave community and the pansexual scene. Those people aren't even on FetLife a lot, as far as I can tell, which is a great way to sort of measure how integrated things are. It's like, oh, well, if those people are on FetLife, then it means they're integrated into the pansexual scene, basically. But if they're not, then usually they're not. Like that's kind of where most of the pansexual scene operates out of. It's a base of operations for all that people are constantly yelling at FetLife and trying to make it change.
So I'm curious then, how would you define somebody who is like that level of master and slave? Are you talking about like MS title holders, like Master and Slave Northwest, like 2020 people, and people who attend like masked meetings, for example? Or is there something even more?
Yeah, that's
okay. There's something even more underground than that, because I have met those people in the general BDSM community here, though not at local events. Like if I go to a dungeon night, I wouldn't see them. But if I go to a convention, then they're there. And so they definitely, it's sort of like we have the annual gatherings kind of where everybody gets together, right? And then throughout the rest of the year, we all kind of, go off and do our own thing.
Yeah, no, I was just talking about the kinds of people who go to Masters and Slaves together and those types of associations. And a lot of them are in the BDSM scene, a lot of them even here. But the culture of those events is very different. So people often have really different ideas about how they want to live, and it makes it sometimes difficult for them to get together. The same is true, and it depends on where you are, as to how well integrated the queer BDSM scene is with the pansexual scene where you go. In some places, they're very well integrated. My statistics strongly suggest to me that they're better integrated in San Francisco. Shocking, I know, than they are some other places. So, I mean, and also some of that too is numbers, right? Like in some places, there's just enough of those people that they can afford to be more separate. Whereas when you're getting to smaller areas, people are forced to hang out together because there's just fewer of them. And that's true all over the place. And there's, a good reason why the biggest BDSM organizations have historically been in DC area, New York City area, and San Francisco area, right? There's a lot of people there. There's a long history of gay community in those places, which is part of, I think, where some of that comes from. There's just plenty of people with disposable income and time to support a BDSM community in those places. And then, of course, also, as I said before, charismatic individuals matter as well. So if you look at the DC community, a guy named Jack McGeorge was huge in creating, all over the country, really. He's very famous. He was like a UN inspector, I think, and totally out. And it was a big deal. And he did a lot of work for the BDSM community here and all over the country. And so any of those places have they're much bigger, stronger, better history. But then, more recent places have sprung up for sure as people move to those places and also have disposable income and time. Because unfortunately, those things tend to be required in order to set up a BDSM community.
Yeah, there's so much that goes into it. And I think it's something at least in my age range, we don't necessarily, have as much conscious awareness of, because we kind of did grow up in the age of FetLife, when we turned 18 and we were like, I'm kinky, I want to find other kinky people. Oh, there's FetLife. Oh, there's a local dungeon. Boop, I'm going to go on a Friday night. As opposed to kind of maybe understanding that larger historical background of like, this is the history of the community. And like, I know here, our big local dungeon that's been kind of on and off probably for the last 20 years at this point. I think the first ever kind of iteration of it was like this little coffee shop in like 1999. And then eventually it grew to be the local dungeon. And it's more or less kind of vaguely been the same organization ever since then.
Yeah. I mean, if you want the historical perspective for a lot of these, it's, a lot of it's somebody who started a thing in their basement, basically. But typically it's a few very well organized people who happen to get together and at the same time were highly motivated, and they wanted to do the thing, and so they did. But if before that, so I mean, obviously, I'm looking. My interviews are from 2012, so while ago now. I think the cutoff line back then was somewhere in the vicinity of like 35-ish. Certainly by age 40, people had not come to the scene via the internet back then. Although a lot of them in the DC area, amazingly to me, and DC and New York, had come from like magazines. Like these dungeons had advertised in newspapers. And so they had come from those like newspaper advertisements and whatnot. But yeah, the way that people got into the scene back then was very, very different than it is now. Although I also talked to people who told me that a lot of the scene organizing, even in the late 90s, was still happening online through these bulletin board systems for messaging people. A number of people have suggested to me that part of why the BDSM subculture is still to this day so heavily overlapped with the geek subculture is because only geeks had access to those early bulletin board message systems. And so they were the people who really got the scene going. And obviously they too were the kinds of people who had disposable income and time, and were also less likely to lose their jobs. And so, there was a whole confluence there of reasons why geeks became people who sort of founded the scene. I think there's probably some other sociological things happening there, but I like that as a mythology of creation, at least. An origin, or a mythology origin story, if you will.
Yeah, there is so much that goes into it. And I know we're like 30 minutes into this conversation at this point, but I did also want to talk about that original research you did, starting in 2012. And I remember from the presentation you gave, I don't know if this was the main question, if that was the main focus, or that was what you just decided to talk about mostly for the presentation, but the idea that is kink inherently sexual and different people's responses to that. Would you mind speaking about a little bit on that for the audience, for people who aren't familiar with that question or what your findings were?
Basically, what happens is that you've got a bunch of people in the BDSM subculture who say that kink is not sexual. And I think in the presentation, I believe, was from 2016. And so since then, I did my survey and I collected actual numbers on this. So to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only person who has the numbers on this. And I can tell you approximately, at least according to my survey, and which I believe is reasonably representative of the scene, what people's opinion on that is. And that is that the clear majority of kinky people actually do say that BDSM is motivated, at least partly, for sex. The degree to which people are involved in the scene also affects how much they say that. So as people become more involved in the BDSM subculture, they are less likely to say that they are motivated by sex. 32% of people who are highly involved in the scene say that BDSM is mostly not sexual for them. So it's about a third who are saying it's, again, mostly not. And it's a very, very few people who say that it's not at all. It's like 4%. But at the point where they're highly involved in the scene, 32% are saying that it's mostly not or not at all, compared with only 14% of people who are low involved. So I have 3 scales: low, medium, high, and it clearly goes up. Like as people's scene involvement goes up, they are much less likely to say that BDSM is sexual for them. And then I also asked people on the survey about if they preferred for their BDSM play to include sex, a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And again, basically the same idea. People who are more involved in the scene, far more likely to say that they prefer for their BDSM play to not include sex. So that said, I also asked the question in reverse about how often their sex-involved BDSM, and the opposite happens. So as people become more involved in the scene, then they say that their sex is much more likely to involve BDSM. The kink gets less sexy, but the sex gets kinkier with increasing levels of scene involvement. And to some degree, I think that happens because the scene teaches people to see BDSM as being motivated by more things, right? As you become more involved in the scene, you're like, oh, there's all these other reasons I could do BDSM too, and that's really fun. Alternatively, and I think both things happen, as people come to the scene who are just there for the sex, then they're like, this is boring, and they leave. Because if you go to most BDSM events, they are remarkably not sexed, like, frequently. It's pretty rare for you to go to BDSM events that are just like really heavy on the sex. And especially if you're talking about weekend local dungeon parties, they really just don't tend to be particularly sexual affairs. And so those people leave. And then then I found a number of different factors that influence that, some of which I can explain pretty easily and some of which I can't. So for example, I found that people who are in the femdom subculture, which is to say women who identify as dominant men, cis women who identify as dominant, cis men who identify as submissive, were way less likely than everybody else to want BDSM to involve sex. And I think a lot of that comes from pro-doming and the influence of that, plus the porn associated with it. As people got older, they were more likely to say that they wanted their BDSM to include sex, which is maybe the opposite of what people might have predicted. It was what I predicted based on my observation, but I still can't account for it because actually over time, BDSM events got a lot more sexual. So you would think that the older people would be less likely to want sex with their BDSM. Cis men were slightly more likely than cis women to want their BDSM to include sex. I think gender others were the least likely, although I don't think that was statistically significant. That's the answer to that by the numbers. And then when I actually talked to people from that in a qualitative perspective, people's opinions just vary wildly. Some people are just like, yes, clearly BDSM is about sex. I literally have no idea what people are getting out of this who aren't doing it for sex, up to people who are just like, no, this isn't sexual for me at all. Okay, what do you make of that? And I think the answer is that we have very different experiences of this very complicated thing, and also too that BDSM itself is very varied. Some of the more nuanced responses to that I got too were from people who are like, well, some things I do are highly sexual for me and some things aren't. And so, some people describe their experiences of it too, much like in my own experience of it, where they initially arrived in the scene, they thought it was all for sex then, and then over time they were like, oh, actually I can get all these other things out of it. So the other thing that I found from doing my survey was that as people's involvement in the scene increased, their motivations for doing their number, just straight up the number of different reasons that they gave for engaging in BDSM increased. So I included physical non-sexual pleasure, including sensual pleasure and non-sexual masochism. Again, definitely goes up as scene involvement goes up. Altered mental state, which is things like we were mentioning earlier with subspace, goes up a lot as people get more involved in the scene. Spirituality, which I mentioned before, connections, feeling of emotional closeness, adrenaline, physical excitement, physical or emotional challenge, emotional pleasure and satisfaction, including non-sexual sadism, service, giving or receiving. Role play is the only one that goes down as scene involvement goes up, which I find hilarious. So I think the scene kind of tends to sometimes be a little bit snotty about certain forms of role play. Although when they're into it, they're really into it. Satisfying primal urges. And I think when I interviewed people, that was everything that I came up with, like from my interview. Oh, the last one was aesthetics, so including aesthetic objectification, artistry, and visual pleasure. And that's pretty much everything that I ever have heard people name. And I left a category for other there, and almost no one wrote anything in it. So I think I got everything. I hope I did. And I think it's pretty telling that, like, as I have done BDSM and become more involved in the scene, like, I would say I doubt that I legitimately could have checked any box other than sex when I got in there personally. But I think I could very honestly check all of them now that I've been involved for 10 years. So I would definitely say that my experience of being in the scene has taught me to appreciate a lot of different things. And to this day, there are things that I don't understand why I love. Like, I am really, really, really deeply involved in rope bottoming, like hardcore rope bottoming, which means I get tied up in some really intense ways. And I still don't fully understand what I love about it. Like, I can describe it very precisely, but I can't make sense of my own experience of enjoyment from it. And I don't have a way to easily, I can put it in the boxes that I just named, but I can't personally yet make sense of it on a qualitative level. And I've started recently tying, and I really don't understand why I enjoy that. But I know that I do. So shrug, I don't know. I think maybe that it's possible that there are boxes left here that I don't have, but I think it's there. I just haven't figured out where to put it. But my point is that people in the scene disagree a lot about how sexual BDSM is, but the vast majority, even among people who are highly involved, of people say that it is mostly sexual for them, right? We're talking like 2/3 of people are saying that it is mostly sexual for them most of the time. But 1/3 of people is a lot of people, right? So, and when you're talking about the people who are highly involved, these are also the people who are doing a lot of the shaping of the messaging, that comes from the community and to the community. And a lot of that is very desexualized for a lot of reasons. I think the scene has historically been highly motivated to desexualize itself as a way to try to make it look better to outsiders. I was at an event recently where officially the rules said that you weren't allowed to have sex, and then the organizers were like, well, they just told us once we got there, like, we have to put that on the printed thing, but we're not going to enforce it. Or, like, we have to put that there so that it looks good to the people on the outside. I've been to a number of places that were like that, where sort of officially you weren't allowed to have sex, but illicitly they're like, whatever. But they felt like they had to do that as a matter of self-preservation to other people and the outsiders. And then also, I think the scene wants to attract people who are mostly motivated by BDSM, whereas if they attract people who are mostly motivated by sex, then they feel like it's getting people's motivations aren't pure, right? They're there to get laid, and the scene often has a fairly low view of people who are there to get laid. I also have that on my survey. People tend to have a pretty negative view of men who they believe are there. They're much more apathetic about the women. They're very low view of men who they think are just there to get laid. And so prioritizing attracting the kind of people who are mostly interested in BDSM is helpful to the subculture. I think ultimately the scene teaches people to view kink as being less about sex. And it teaches them a lot of other reasons for doing it other than sex. And I have another weird statistical way that I show that with my numbers. So basically, the more BDSM partners that you've had recently compared to the number of sex partners that you've had, the more likely you are to say that that BDSM is not sexual for you, basically, which again isn't really surprising, right? Because I'm using both factors at the same time. But essentially, like, if you've had more sex partners recently, then you're more likely to say that BDSM is sexual for you. Whereas if you had more BDSM partners recently, then you're more likely to say that it's not sexual for you. So my friend refers to it as the wine snob hypothesis, where basically kinksters learn to distinguish these subtle flavors of motivation for kink that other people just couldn't possibly see, right? To an outsider, it's just like, this is why you're doing this. This is clearly sexual and erotic. But to the people doing it, no, it's this complicated, like, 20 different reason thing that's not sexual. And, like, who's right? I don't know. I genuinely don't know, right? Have we just been taught to overanalyze our reasons for doing BDSM? Or is it real? And as a sociologist, that's a question I don't particularly care to answer. But I do think it's interesting. The longer you're in the scene, the more you're taught to parse these very fine, subtle flavors of pleasure, which would be a great title for my book, actually, if they won't let me use Please Scream Quietly. Flavors of pleasure, subtle flavors of pleasure, I think is something that the scene really teaches.
Yeah, I think that can definitely be a factor. It is really hard to understand kind of where all of these things separate out, because before you started talking about all of this, my previous inclination was to go to the idea that a lot of people assume right away that BDSM is sexual, and it's easier for a vanilla person outside of the community to go, oh, that's a sex thing, because they know what sex is. They know what sexual pleasure feels like. Whereas if you try to explain it from those other motivations that are just completely outside of their experience, like, okay, but why do you like getting his coffee every morning at 4 a.m. and cleaning his boots every day? Like, why would you like that? You're just an unpaid maid. And having to explain those things, I think, can be more difficult than going for the sexual connotation. But then there is also that kind of, oh, no, this isn't a weird sex thing. I promise I'm not one of those fetish people, right? You know, this isn't I'm not like a violator or something. I think that maybe has a more negative connotation. And there was recently an idea that was presented to me where when you are in a minority community, there is a tendency to want to feel superior to other members of that minority group, sort of in a way, like creating a minority group hierarchy where it's like, oh, you know, BDSM lifestylers are above the fetishists, are above the weekend bedroom only people, right? And I think that can also be one of the reasons for the difference in explanation as well.
Absolutely. And I do write in my book a lot about those distinctions of status. And I actually have an entire chapter on the way that Kinksters create status hierarchies, although I mostly look at it specifically within themselves. But you're absolutely right. So, I mean, you know, one of the classic distinctions there is the way that Kinksters will just celebrate bruises, right? Like you go to a lot of kink events and there will be an award for best bruises, that kind of thing. People really are into the bruises versus the spanking community, which again overlaps with pansexual BDSM community, but often is fairly distinct. And the general norm there is, well, oh no, you don't bruise somebody. We just like the pink gases, right? And I think Kinksters as a group tend to kind of giggle at that. They're like, oh, that's not real kink, you know, that's just cute. And whereas I think the spanking fetishists think of these BDSM people as like, you know, crazy hardcore, kink gone wild, something like that. But yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of, I mean, the main group of people, for anyone who's listening to this who doesn't know, the main group of people in the pansexual BDSM community who are adjacent to tend to really diss and mock as swingers. So much so that the main group on FetLife for swingers is called Swingers Is Not a Dirty Word. And and there's, again, a lot of reasons why, which is that they tend to actually be pretty close to one another. A lot of public dungeons are BDSM dungeons or swingers clubs on alternating nights. So the communities end up overlapping, but their values are just so different, especially related to consent, but even also in terms of politics and relationships, that they really have a lot of negative relationships with each other that can be just utterly mind-boggling to outsiders who often are just like, wait, aren't you guys the same people?
Yeah, it's like the two siblings that just don't get along over anything, you know?
Exactly. That's a great way to describe swingers and kinksters.
But I did actually want to talk a little bit about that because of, you know, my own experience of being an asexual person in the community, which is one of the reasons why I found your study so fascinating. Is the way that I've always described it is it's not a sexual experience for me, but I can understand that it could be sexual for other people. But then it also depends on how you define sex, right? Because I know people that they do like Hitachis and rope bondage scenes and they orgasm 10 times and that's not sexual. Or they do consensual non-consent play scenes or like gangbangs and they're like, oh, that wasn't sexual, it was about power. Right. And was that something that you found in your research as people describing those experiences?
I mean, I definitely have people describing things that way. I mean, I've got people describing things in ways that just genuinely don't genuinely don't make sense to me. Like, I tried, you know, I mean, I'm interviewing people, but this is a subjective experience, you know, so I'm like, I don't know how to make sense of it. But yeah, I've got a quote from someone in my book where they're talking about how, oh, you know, I can orgasm from topping somebody, which is really unusual, but, you know, kink isn't sexual to me. And I'm like, but you just said you had an orgasm. I'm so confused. And I got like another quote from someone who's talking about riding a Sibian, which is a sex machine, basically. And they're like talking about how they had all these orgasms, but this wasn't about sex. And I'm like, okay, I mean, I'm going to have to trust them, right? Like, on some level, I get it. I have a partner that I engage in some really, really, really heavy dominance and submission play with, and most of that involves sex, but definitely, like, the sex is a means to an end far more than the end in itself in that arrangement. So I understand that personally on that level, but for me, kink is mostly very sexual. So I run into trouble trying to parse some of these things when I'm talking to people. I try, but this is a little bit like asking people, you know, to describe colors they see, right? Like, tell me about green, you know. It's a very, very subjective experience. And two, people aren't agreeing on what sexual means, right? I mean, if you orgasm, does that make it sexual? I mean, I don't know. We'd have to all agree on what sexual meant, right? Even trying to say erotic, like, are you turned on? Is that why you're doing this? And, you know, like you, I've witnessed people do these Hitachi scenes with rope, and they're like, oh, but that wasn't sexual. And I'm like, And then, you know, conversely, I'll go through events. And again, for people listening, you may be bewildered, but there's like this weird norm a lot of times in BDSM land where someone will have like a brand new toy, like a flogger or paddle or something. And they're just really happy about it. So they like wander up to like random strangers and be like, hey, can I hit you with my brand new paddle? And people will ask me that, and I'll say, are you going to make me come? And they're like, no. And they look at me kind of weird, like, why would that? I was like, then no. You may not hit me with that unless you're going to make me orgasm. And that's not normative in the scene, right? Like, most people don't say that, partly because there is this like separation a lot of times that people have been taught to make, but also because I think a lot of people don't have that experience, right? Whereas for me, pain is most pain. Most of the pains that I like, I'll be really careful, most non-related pain for me personally is very sexual, and I'm not interested in it unless I'm turned on or I'm trying to get that way. And that is, I think, a little peculiar for people in the scene, actually, from my interviewing with people and interacting with people. Although I definitely think that there is a gender difference on that one. And again, even as a sociologist, I hesitate to say gender difference on that one. I think there might actually be a little bit of a biological difference there. It seems like people who were born men more likely to have these like sexual correlations of these experiences, and there is again some basis for that in literature. Like although it seems to be based on testosterone from the little bit that I've seen of these studies that tried to look at this with regards to trans people, that basically testosterone is linked to actual fetishes. It's not something that tends to happen to people who don't have testosterone, which is to say people who genuinely need something in order for a state of something non-sexual in order to be sexually aroused. And they tend to be whereas our cultural idea of fetishes tends to be pretty out there, like scuba diving gear or whatever. Usually most people I've met with fetishes actually have bizarrely innocent ones. So like I met someone who had a fetish for having a woman put her hands over his eyes. Right? Like it's just really, really small, innocent things like that people often develop fetishes for. But when I say people, it's usually people with testosterone. It's not something that's really ever been documented much for people without it. So, I mean, I definitely think that there is a gender / possibly biological sex difference in some people's experience of the sexuality of kink. With regards to asexuals and kink, there is actually an academic paper on that.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's called Ace of Spades, and and they actually did a pretty decent job. They studied asexuals in the scene in Chicago, I think. So yeah, you might want to check that out.
Yeah, I will. I know obviously because of my audience and the fact that I talk about asexuality, I have a higher percentage than normal of asexual BDSM people that I'm aware of. And I know a few people locally. And that has always been one of our struggles, I think, in the community, especially because here there is so much overlap between the general pansexual BDSM community and the leather community, and even to some extent the MS people. I find that leather people tend to have a much more sexual language in the way that they describe experiencing BDSM compared to the pansexual community. And so sometimes I have to stop my brain and be like, okay, when they say something is really hot, what can I translate that to in my brain that makes sense? And I think that's really interesting that they did a study on that. So I will certainly check that out. Did you find anything related to asexuality in your own studies?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've personally spent more time studying this weird intersection that I refer to as kink sexuality than I have on asexuality per se. And people who I classify as kink sexual, who mostly tend to jump on that label as soon as they hear it, are people who say that they feel like their sexuality, such as it is defined much more by their interest in BDSM than anything else. And so frequently these are people who will enthusiastically embrace phrases like, I am not interested in sex unless it involves BDSM. And the only reason why I would ever have sex is because of BDSM, essentially. I interviewed a couple of different people, I intentionally sought several of them out, who had these experiences where, they would say things like, yeah, I've had sex, but if it doesn't involve kink, then I'm not interested. And the kink is the part that really is the interesting thing for me. Some of these people do identify as gray sexual, meaning they're like kind of in that hazy territory between asexual and whatever the thing is that's next up on the list. I actually personally believe that there's a spectrum that goes from asexual to hypersexual, and those of us on the hypersexual end of things haven't been doing as good a job at politically organizing. But whatever the next step is up from asexual, I guess, on that spectrum is where a lot of folks on the gray sexual part of it are. And a lot of them end up in the BDSM scene because they're interested in cuddling, they're interested in physical touch, they're interested in those types of relationships, and they are okay with the idea of having sex if it makes the other person happy.
That is like exactly my experience in a nutshell, because I also identify as gray as like my primary label under the ace spectrum, and that is exactly it.
Yeah,
so.
And you're not alone, right? So there's a lot of people in the scene who are in that vein, and they frequently end up being submissive, but not exclusively, partly because of that whole, well, I'll have sex with them if it makes them happy thing. But, or rather, they're only really having sex a lot of times under unconventional sex, let's say, in a submissive role. Or if they're doing it as a dominant, it's just as a way to show power, really, rather than for sexual gratification in the way that people typically experience that. I interviewed several people like that, and I've spent a lot of time hanging out. I've had several play partners like that, and they always have a lot of them are attracted to rope, which I think is interesting. But people in that vein, I think, are just, they're motivated by something that just doesn't fit with conventional attitudes about sex and sexuality. And as much as they have something to define for themselves there, they think of it as being defined by kink. Calling it kink sexual might be is a label of convenience there, right? Because it's not maybe as much about sex as it is about something else, but it's about identity. Much the same way that, people ask me about my sexual identity. If you leave me free to answer however you want, I will say my sexual identity is slut, because of how I experience the world is not really about gender. It's not really about biology. It's far more about having a preference for polyamory, polysexuality, and variety. And those are the things that matter to me, but not necessarily the things that matter to most people. Talk about people like kink sexual or gray sexual right there, then you're sort of talking about people who are like, it's not really the motivating factor for the sex is not the motivating factor for me. It's the kink. That for those people at that point, I think it's really interesting to see how they choose to do sex. But most of the ones I talk to, so they have very few sexual partners. They don't have sex very often with the people that they do. And, they're happy that way.
So I'm wondering, with all of this, I don't know if you've heard the debate, I don't know if you can call it that, about people who are either very for or very against inclusion of kink as a sexual identity or as something that should be part of like the LGBT plus umbrella. Have you heard anything about that?
I've heard lots about it. I mean, it's hard to hang around this community and not hear anything about it. I mean, my personal take on that is that I'm kind of willing personally to accept anyone under the queer umbrella who's felt like that they were, especially if there's evidence that they were oppressed for their sexual and relationship desires. And I know a number of people who lost their jobs for being kinky. So I'm willing to take them personally, but I don't think I get to be the queer police. I definitely think polyamory is far more unconventional at this point than if you're, a married gay person living in the suburbs with your 2 children and your white picket fence. And you have fewer legal protections as a polyamorous person, even than you do as a gay person, which is saying a lot given that you don't have many protections as a gay person. I don't think there's an academic argument to be made for that. I think that just comes down to personal opinion. I've been trying to come up with an academic argument in any direction on that. And I think it really just comes down to, is your umbrella about socialization? Is your umbrella about shame? Is your umbrella about mating? Right? A lot of those people don't want straight asexuals in there either, right? They're like, especially if you're like married to someone of the opposite sex. I'm like, well, lots of married people who are married to someone of the opposite sex aren't having sex with their partner. Like, why are we including straight asexuals here? I mean, it just depends on what's your motivation. Like, why is your umbrella shaped the way that it is shaped? And for me personally, it's to shield people from the reign of social disapprobation. Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of kinky people get a lot of shame for what they do. I mean, of course, a lot of times kinky people get passing privilege, but so do bisexuals, and the numbers on that actually say that they do worse for bisexuals say they do worse for that. So anybody listening who doesn't know, bisexuals actually have the worst mental health and highest suicide risk of gay, lesbian, and bisexuals, so much so that several people have suggested that we need to focus on bisexuals, like, specifically because it's so much worse for them. So passing privilege isn't always a good thing.
Yeah, because I mean, it seems like a crazy situation where you don't really feel at home in either place. Because it's like, well, I'm not really straight, but I have to like pretend to be straight to fit in, and then I'm not gay enough to hang out with the other gay people. And it can definitely create a sense of social isolation, because at least here, I have not really observed a specific bisexual community in the way there is a specific gay community, in the way there is a specific lesbian community, right? And not having that social support network is a factor.
For me, and I'm pretty sure from a lot of the people that I've talked to, the bisexual community is the BDSM scene. Yeah. That's what we've got.
Yeah.
And it was relatively recently that I started really thinking of myself in those terms. I was like, I mean, I am really kinky. Like, I can't lie, I am. But it's kind of like, it's not a key thing for me. But being in a place where bisexuality is just normal and normative and easy, like, that's really nice in a way that I don't care as much about the kink, frankly. But like, there is no bi community outside the scene in anywhere that I've been either. And it's like, it's really nice. Like, it's really, really nice to be in a place where bisexuality is normal and accepted and easy.
So now that you've done all of this work and all of these studies, is there anything else that's left? Like, what further questions has this research left you with?
I think that, first of all, if you aren't familiar, anybody listening, like, the BDSM scene went through some pretty hard transitions right after I did my survey, starting around June of 2017. A lot of people have gotten kicked out for issues related to consent violation. I think ripe for study is people's perspective on that, how the community has shifted, what does it look like now in the wake of all that, now going on 3 years later. Has anything actually changed? I mean, if you don't actually have the research on that, it's hard to say, but if it still looks pretty much the same that it does the way I describe in my book, then I think it's probably fair to say that nothing really did change. I don't know, but I definitely think that there's a lot to be looked at with regards to, I refer to it as the consent-related chaos, so just the community struggling with itself over its norms about regulating consent, and there's a lot a lot left to research for that. During my time in the scene, perspectives on bottoming and bottoming education changed a lot. And again, my interviews are from 2012, so I think looking at seeing if people's perspective on, I know people's perspective on that has changed since then. It hasn't had a huge impact yet, but especially for somebody starting off doing research nowish, I think you would probably see some interesting changes continuing, hopefully, over the next few years, as people, I think, have started to really take bottoming a lot more seriously than they did when I was doing mine. One of the biggest things left to study is overlapping subcultures. So in general, sociology is pretty bad for some reason at researching the idea of overlapping subcultures. I guess people just tend to get lost in their own little places. But there's this massive overlap between the geek subculture, the poly subculture, the kink subculture, the pagan subculture, the Ren Fair subculture. Like, all of these are so heavily overlapped. And I think most of the time, anyone who's heavy involved in one of them just doesn't realize what's happening in the others. I'm heavily involved with the pagan subculture and the BDSM subculture, so I was able to see the way that some of the same types of things were happening in both simultaneously that a lot of people in one or the other of them didn't have. But I still don't know really what's going on in the geek subculture, for example. So like stuff happening at Dragon Con or whatever. Understanding more about these overlapping subcultures would be great for sociology in general as a concept, but also really interesting in terms of gaining perspective for the scene. Role of race in the scene just remains extremely unexplored, partly because it's just not something that anyone who isn't a minority researcher themselves is likely to really be able to undertake. There seems to be a bit of, like, for example, a related but slightly distinct Black BDSM scene. I have no idea where Hispanic Kinksters go. I've met lots of Black Kinksters in the scene, but I know so few people who are Hispanic in the scene. So I have no idea where Hispanic Kinksters go. All of these questions, I think, are definitely ripe for research. And then, obviously, you just need more research from other kinky insiders, because I'm just one person. I mean, yeah, I've been doing this a long time, but, like, things change, and they change fast in a subculture like this. You know, like, my experiences, I came into this I started doing this research when I was like 32-ish, early 30s. You know, someone coming in now, I think, would have a very different experience also of young kinksters and the world of age, right? I mean, how old you are in the scene matters a lot in terms of your experience of it. So, I mean, there's a lot of room left to explore all of that. And then, too, all of the subcultures that I mentioned. Femdom subculture is going through some interesting transitions. Rope subculture also, like, they have their own issues that they're working through in those subcultures. So I think there's also a lot to look at in those places. Obviously, everything that I'm talking about directions for further research, I mean, I'm just talking about the US pansexual scene. Everything that I just said about, for example, sex and sexuality, like, we don't know anything really about to compare that to how folks in the leather scene, I mean, like, we think that they seem more sexual about it. That's how they present themselves. I have no idea what would happen if you actually took a survey. In general, there's just practically no survey research on kinky people, right? And for a long time, that was reasonable. With the advent of FetLife, that was unreasonable. Now FetLife is kind of not so great for that anymore, so I don't know how you do it. The window of opportunity is closed. Maybe it will open again.
Well, isn't it now that, like, everyone has that little, like, blip in their profile about, like, government agencies and universities are not allowed to use their profile for research?
Oh, no, that was a long time ago. No, the issue is way more just that for a while there, for several years, if you were in the pansexual scene, you were on FetLife, and there was a pretty good chance you were on FetLife basically every day. Like, you couldn't not be. Even I knew people who were, like, whining about it. They're like, fuck, I hate being online or whatever. And there's still, like, FetLife was open on their phone. And then after the scene started having so many issues in 2017, FetLife just sort of turned into this giant forum of argument, and people started closing down, right? They're just not on it very much anymore. I mean, everybody still has a FetLife account because they have to, but almost nobody's ever actually there. And so, like, the rope community mostly moved to Instagram, and then lots of people moved to Twitter, and it became a lot more segmented, just like most of the rest of the internet is now. But for a long time, it was super cohesive. It was really easy to get kinky people just by being on FetLife. And but there's, to the best of my knowledge, like, there's no corresponding website for people in the leather scene. There's definitely no corresponding website like that for poly people. So there's no way to just easily just access all poly people. But right up until the moment, like right after I did my survey, you pretty much could get everybody in the pansexual scene by being on FetLife. But alas, no more.
Yeah, you log in, you find events, and you log out before you have to look at all the messages of people asking to be your slave.
Yeah, I think that's become a lot of how people interact on FetLife these days. Or it's also in my area. A lot of times you actually have to RSVP to a party on FetLife in order to be allowed to go, which is not true in a lot of other areas. But in my area, it is. You log in long enough to RSVP to the party, and then they're just gone off of FetLife. But it didn't used to be like that, and so. Yeah, times change. I mean, that's another thing that's certainly open for more study is the use of the internet as a means to interact with kink. But in fact, I saw somebody looking for papers for that the other day. It's that one's tricky because anything that you write is going to be obsolete by the time you're even close to publishing it. Right? So we're going to be writing about a bunch of websites that just don't even exist anymore.
Mm-hmm. Ah, yes, alt.com, the thing all Kinksters use to talk about BDSM.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, were there any other final thoughts or things you wanted to mention before we wrap up today?
If you are interested in reading more about this, hopefully you can check out my book. Hopefully it will be called Please Scream Quietly. You can always check out my blog, slutphd.com. I also have some sex advice tips on Xtube as IP Cookie Monster. Very different experiences, I guess, there of listening to my academic work versus listening to me explain how to give blowjobs. I have a lot of diverse interest in these things. So hopefully I'm planning to be on Instagram. I have an Instagram account as both SlutPhD and IP Cookie Monster as well. And IP Cookie Monster is always more of my personal stuff, whereas Slut PhD, I try to keep more of my academic stuff. So you can find me on Twitter for both of those as well. And yeah, you can follow my crazy kinky life on those places. I post lots of personal stuff as well as my academic observations, and sometimes this weird hybrid where I write highly opinionated things that are based on my academic observations.
Well, thank you so much again for being here. And then links to all of those things if people want to ask questions or just keep up with your social media or figure out when your book's coming out. Links to all of those sites will be down in the description box below. If you guys have any other comments or questions for me, you can leave them down in the comment section of this video. Again, thank you guys so much for listening, and I will see you all again very soon. Bye!